Just to alert our sensitive viewers, this episode may contain a bit of coarse language.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Blumendahl.
And my name is Rocco Catroni, and we are the Disability Tangent Podcast.
Each episode, we talk about current issues affecting communities while supporting people with disabilities.
Through research, community connections, and resource sharing, we hope to invite everybody to challenge their perceptions of people with disabilities and promote a more inclusive world.
Defined by what the people actually want and not what others think they want.
Come join us on this journey.
Oh my gosh.
Mind-boggling.
Mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling how technology won't work when we're trying to utilize the technology. That's mind. Is it mind-boggling, or is it just the nature of technology to not work when you really need the technology?
I don't know. That gets into whether or not anything has a true nature to it, or whether or not it's just something we're interacting with appropriately or inappropriately.
That is too philosophical for this. Too.
It's 11:10 on a Friday. We can't be talking about this shit.
I was going to say, I have a philosophy degree, so I'm allowed to talk this shit anytime I want to, but also it's too much.
I too have a philosophy degree.
Philosophy degrees all around.
I watched this really insightful TED Talk. In Chicago, they have street philosophy meetups every once in a while. It actually looks kind of cool. I mean, It seems like a bunch of people that get together and drink and talk philosophy, and that honestly sounds wonderful.
That seems like most of my life. Why
are we not drinking more during these podcast recordings, Christy?
Because we're having them at 10 a.m. That's...
Screwdrivers exist. Bloody Marys. We're missing out on a key...
I mean, an Aperol Spritz. Those they taste good in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, anytime.
Yeah, everything tastes good when you're motivated enough.
We can start with mimosas and end with scotch. The whole day can be alcohol.
Right.
I don't know if my liver can handle that, but the rest of me probably can. That's what juice cleanses are for.
My juice cleanse makes me feel funny.
No, you're supposed to not put the alcohol in the juice when you do the juice cleanse.
Well, then clearly I've been doing this wrong. I mean, I am definitely cleansed.
My spirits is cleansed by the juice with the alcohol.
Spirits are cleansed by spirits. It makes sense.
Spirits cleanse me. Okay, so this is our first technical tangent.
It's such a tangent. We started off with a tangent before we even announced the other.
We've been having an hour of tangent before we even start the tangent episode. Okay.
Welcome to this episode. Today we're going to talk about wokeness and its placement within DEI and positions of privilege.
Yes, we are going to talk about wokeness and DEI.
Yeah, so maybe, Christy, how did we even get to this as one of the topics? I think it started off as we were reading articles in the news recently, and what kind of happened? How did we get here?
First of all, I follow lots of people on social media who are doing disability advocacy, and this is a thing that's been popping up in the news a lot. This anti-DEI, anti-woke sentiment that seems to be popping up all over the place. Politicians are using it, and I think that falls a lot on American politicians, but not just in the United States. There are also people in other countries who are using this sort of anti-woke sentiment. And it's interesting because the idea is anti-DEI, and I think that is meant to portray an anti-race policy kind of situation. But DEI encompasses the inclusion of disabled people. And so by saying you want anti-woke policies and anti-DEI, then you're automatically placing limitations on more limitations, because obviously we already have limitations, but even more limitations on disabled people who are trying to be hired and be included in education and be included in all sorts of systems that they generally are not included. So that lack of inclusion and lack of diversity, it's a problem. It's a huge problem. How about you, Rocco? Where are you seeing this pop up, and what has been your experience with this?
I think part of this was some of our conversations that you and I have had, that even within these anti-DEI policies, many of those DEI policies don't include people with disabilities to begin with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even if there is provision for individuals with disabilities, then removing that is what little the policy was already trying to help and assist with, especially when we're taking in like intersectional considerations, that just completely goes away. One of the things that has been popping up a lot for me, especially just being in the circles of academia, there's whole institutions that are getting rid of DEI positions, and it's been increasingly difficult to hire things like a chief diversity officer or someone in a position where they can actually create those changes across a campus. It usually falls on the professors and the students, and in many ways it should, right? Those are the people that are operating within that system, but many times those things are not supported by the university itself. So it's, yes, you can implement this DEI component. You can have a committee, you can have events, all of these pieces, but the university is not going to support it financially or give professors or students the time to be able to do this. It's very much an extra thing to begin with. So even if that's not a direct, we don't support this, DEI initiative, or we're going to try to remove DEI positions, by not doing anything, it's also kind of acting the same way. And in many times it's more frustrating because many of these places will say, yes, we're all about DEI. This is a pillar of our institution. This is something that we have to think about, and it almost becomes a hit term. But then when you actually say, okay, well, what do you actually do? And it's like, well, I'll talk to these 5 people. And the university can't really tact exactly what they're doing besides, look at all these people we've included in here. And it's still the same conversation we've had for 20 or 30 years of, look how diverse our student population is. But having that diversity as part of the makeup of the institution is not enough. You also have to be able to have that person feel safe within that institution as well. And I think that's where these things are failing.
Absolutely. And I think that brings up another point, which I know we've talked about, and it has come up in some of these other episodes already, is like this hidden cost, right? Not the financial part of it, maybe, but like the burdensome part of it, so that the onus becomes on the disabled person to get their own assistance. So if you're not having that supported by the university financially, or you're saying talk to these 5 people or whatever else, like the onus is then placed on these few people to be putting these things in place, and that ends up putting more and more burden on you. So you're not just trying to figure out how to be a student or trying to figure out how to be a professor or figuring out how to be a employee. You're also trying to figure out how to do that with the extra accommodation and extra support and extra whatever that you need. So you're fighting for the things that you need alongside having to do all of the other things, which is a huge burden in many cases. So it's
Exactly.
not just enough to have to work 40 hours or write papers or whatever else, but now I have all of these other things placed upon me, and my life already probably has extra needs or challenges within it because of my disability. So yeah,
Exactly. And
it's
that's
more.
in a system that has at least some systems associated with it too. Because I mean, in university and other educational settings, ADA compliance and accommodations is a state and federal requirement, but not
Yeah.
necessarily in the workplace. So even in the place where there is some kind of structure that you can potentially tap into, it doesn't work in many cases. And it still falls
Yeah.
on very much as an extra thing and not embedded into the culture of the institution itself, which we know after talking with some of our other podcast episode guests, when we start doing more of that inclusive piece, everything else falls into place. Like you're
Yep.
creating these comfortable systems for people to operate and be comfortable and happy, relaxed, engaged, and safe in. And when you don't have that there, or you don't make that a priority, it becomes very much a task, not only as an extra thing for the university, but then it becomes a task and an extra thing for the people. So constantly advocating is tiring. Constantly trying to build something and then having it shut down is tiring, because then that's also taking away from the other portions of the job or your education or whatever those pieces are, because you had to advocate for the thing to be more successful. But because you advocated and not focusing on that thing itself, you start falling behind because that institution, either educational or business, is not supporting you. So it becomes this like weird cycle of not being able to break out of that loop. And it
Yeah.
screws everybody at the end
Right.
of the day, right? It's not just the people with disabilities or the system or the staff members within that. It's also the business itself, because then you're losing business, or you're losing qualified workers or qualified students,
Yeah.
people that should be out there making that difference and providing that model. But if they're not able to do that, then it only perpetuates that inaccessibility in those locations.
Yeah. I know. It's such an interesting thing too, because who decided that it wasn't helpful or wasn't I don't know. Like at what point did someone decide, "Oh, this is unhelpful or this isn't good or this is not beneficial as a concept, and so let's like attack it." Because even in the sense of where was I going? Oh my god. You know what? It's this is a challenge because our video's not working and I have a really hard time keeping my train of thought when I don't have something to look at. This is so bad. Oh my god. It's just, okay. Focus, Christy. Focus.
Tangent. Tangent.
Christy's disability is a tangent in and of
That's,
itself.
this tangent has been brought to you by.
Okay, where was I going? Oh, so it's not a question really for me. Okay, who decided? Well, we know in some cases who decided that this was a thing that they were going to go after. And some of the ideas like why we're going after this make sense to me. Not that they make sense.
Mhm.
Full stop. They don't make sense. But it makes sense to me why, if you are pursuing, say, a political career, you would want to vilify a particular subset of
Mhm.
society in a way that gives you some sense of maybe power or fear or some sort of edge within a privileged subset.
Mhm.
Was that an okay way of saying a thing that didn't over politicize the problem?
I think that was about as soft as we can do that.
Okay.
But I mean, to hit on that idea of vilifying that piece, I mean, sometimes that vilification is not intentional. Sometimes it's by not supporting that thing, or by saying, here is the preferred. Usually that preferred looks more at ability, looks more at prioritizing and reinforcing, frankly, overwork, and have a sense of pride for doing that additional, oh, I stayed up for 12 hours today to do this thing, and look at all this production I have. And it's very performative. And when you make those things more reinforcing and you make that the model, you end up othering everybody that's not able to do that particular thing. So even if it's not something that's intentional that people are doing, I don't know, maybe sometimes it is, but even if it's not intentional, that's the derivation that happens at the end. So then people see, well, if this company or this institution is going to reinforce this type of behavior, this type of action, this type of person doing that, it's sending a message saying, if you don't do this, then you're not part of this company, and you're not going to be reinforced for that, or you're not going to be praised or move
Right.
up in the company or hold down the job or whatever.
Right. Like I'm not going to be welcome in this environment because this environment is not supportive of the way that I need to live my life, or I'm unable to live my life in that manner. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like that is definitely a concern. For me, that's definitely a concern. People
Mm-hmm.
often talk about like the interviewing process or getting to that point. There's so many places that I wouldn't even look at going because I understand
Mhm.
that's not a situation where I could interview. I can't put myself through that kind of rigor. I look at the term bootstrapping, like they
Mm.
use
Mhm.
bootstrapping these days as though it's like some sort of positive, like it's some sort of, oh, I'm bootstrapping. I'm pulling myself up by my bootstraps. I'm making it work on my own, doubling down.
Mhm.
I'm doing all this stuff. No, so the term bootstrapping, like pulling myself up by my bootstraps, was originally a term that said, no, I can't. You can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's an impossibility. Take your shoelaces and try to lift yourself. Is that going to work? No, that's not going to work. Not for anyone. And now people use it as though they're saying, oh, yeah, I've got this. I can start my own company. I can buckle down. I can
Mhm.
make it work without any resources. I can do it all on my own. And
Mhm.
so we're basically taking a term that says this is impossible, and we're saying, I'm going to
Mhm.
now do the impossible. I don't really know. Somehow
Well,
we've made it this term that says if you work really, 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 really hard and murder yourself with work,
mhm.
things will turn around and you'll somehow succeed. And that to me is ludicrous, unhealthy, not supportive of
Mhm.
humanity, the planet, all sorts of things, just not sustainable. And yet,
Exactly.
that's the kind of mindset that we're trying to promote. And that's the kind of thing that if you can't do it, you are being, in some sense, vilified. And I think that if we stopped and thought about it, we would recognize that's not vilifying a portion of society.
Yeah. But I mean,
It's
it
vilifying
also
us all. Like, none of us should be capable of that.
exactly. It also speaks to the whole fact of if you want something enough, and I think we put a lot of weight on intentionality that you have to want this, you have to really set your mind to it, you have to do blah, 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 and you can accomplish anything. And that comes from a very certain place of privilege, meaning that if I want this thing enough, I know I'm going to have access to it. And I
Yeah,
think if you have that kind of mindset, you are operating from a place of privilege because you know that you can access those particular resources
yeah,
versus someone that does that and doesn't have access to those resources. And they're like, well, I'm setting my mind to it. I'm doing all the things and I'm still failing because the system is not letting me in or I don't have access to this in this particular environment. And
right.
I also, just as a qualifier, I fully acknowledge saying that as a white male myself, that there's certain affordances that happen with something like that. And it's hard to see individuals that don't have that same component. And although I've come in contact with my own barriers associated with that, it's severely limited because I don't have some of those same intersectional considerations as well. And it's easy to sit up here and say, this is a problem, but there's only so much lived experience I can speak from. But those are the things that I'm seeing, hearing friends talk about this, hearing my students talk about this. It's asinine.
Yeah.
That's not the expectation that they can operate under because not everybody has the same access to this.
Yeah. And to be fair, like we acknowledge that we definitely have privilege in
Mm-hmm.
many ways. It's so interesting because, and we talk about intersection. I'm struggling today. We talk about interplexible. That's what we're talking about. Yes. No, we talk about
Middleton.
intersectionality. And yes. And if you're not familiar with intersectionality, I think many people are at this point, but I really like Kimberly Crenshaw and the discussion of how these different things intersect.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, being a queer disabled woman, there's a lot there. But I also can really acknowledge that I have white privilege, I have pretty privilege, which,
Mm-hmm.
not to say, I'm sorry, that sounded really, I'm pretty. That sounds bad. I'm a very beautiful person, inside
I
and
have a
out.
face for radio, so I don't know.
I think we both have a reasonable amount of attractiveness, Rocco, that affords us certain things in life. I have educational privilege. That's a huge one that I think a lot of times I don't consider. My parents sent me to school. Good schools were in my area when I was in elementary school. I didn't have to be concerned with whether or not I was going to learn to read. That was a given.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of privilege that I do have. And so I definitely want to acknowledge that. And that's not a given for so many people.
Mm-hmm.
You send your kids to school and they're going to come home after 15 years of school reading at a fourth grade level. And that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge
Mm-hmm.
problem. Sorry, that was a tangent within a tangent.
Yeah.
I don't know where that.
I think it makes sense though, because it flows in that direction. Trying to pick apart what this quote unquote woke agenda pieces or these anti DEI statements, I think we have to talk about the variables that are in place with that. So,
And yeah, and I think that's so much of it. So let's vilify this and vilify that and vilify that. And let's put all of these as the problem when really, the problem is racism. The problem
mm-hmm.
is economic disadvantages. The problem is educational
Capitalism.
systems that aren't, yes, consumerism, capitalism, all of the isms are probably problems. And so I think that's the problem. But if we vilify something else, then we don't have to actually work on the problem. We can maintain our privilege. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's definitely the truest statement about that is that many of the people who are saying, let's attack DEI, are saying, let's not attack my privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Let's attack something else. Without recognizing
Exactly.
that the people that are going to suffer the most are those people in those intersectional spaces, which
Mm-hmm.
are going to be Black disabled women. This is when we start.
As an example, yeah.
Yes, not only those people, but yes, as an example, like where the intersections fall, those are the people who are paid the least employable, not because of their skill set or whatever, but because of that amount of stigma and that amount of being locked out of the system.
Exactly. So then when we're thinking of this kind of thing, if you had to talk about like what woke is and its place in DEI, how would you define it based on what we've read and looked at and talked with people? In what way would you point to something and say, ah, yes, that is quote unquote woke?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting topic. First of all, because, and I think maybe you expect me to bring this up, but the term woke actually comes out of Black culture and was used. I think some of the earliest references were in 1930s, 1940s, actually. But the term woke has been misappropriated over time. And it really meant to stay alert to what was
Mm-hmm.
happening because people were being harmed. Black people, yes. BIPOC communities were having this concern, and it was to like stay awake, stay woke,
Mm-hmm.
notice what was happening. And I think the misappropriation of the term has been this idea of anything that points to privilege of any kind. And it's been really weird. Some of the
Mm-hmm.
reading that you and I have done has been bringing up stuff that it doesn't make any sense. Like they're talking about not teaching critical race theory in kindergarten. Well, critical race theory is a concept that you wouldn't encounter until graduate school. So no one's teaching it in kindergarten. That's not a thing that's happening. So a lot of this misappropriation of wokeness is this idea of anything that has any sort of tie to racial discussion whatsoever, or anything that is in the United States considered leftist in any way. And that's not how I see it at all, though. I would probably see it as more close to its original representation, being aware, having an awareness of what is happening politically, racially. Yeah, what is
Yeah,
happening?
without the negative connotation piece to it. So I think that's totally, at least the way that I interpret it, it
Yeah,
seems like when people say, oh, this is woke, it's almost, yes, I'm aware of this other thing, but then push against any other thing that doesn't fall within that line, like a rigid thinking piece.
yeah.
And I don't think that's the intention of the word. If you're
Oh,
aware, and
yeah,
you can be aware of something and not subscribe to it, right?
yeah,
Or totally support one thing or another. I think that's something that we have to be careful with. It goes back to, I know there was like a bunch of memes and things circulating over the last couple of years saying we could disagree on something and still be friendly. Engaging in discourse is important. But I think when people put this, or when people that push against anti-DEI stuff and anti-woke quote unquote stuff, they're saying that we're forcing our kids to feel bad about themselves, or forcing our kids to, have to completely change their way of life and doing that. And in some ways, yeah, like you should be more inclusive. You should be challenging those notions, but it's not like we're trying to upend and completely pass power, I guess, 100%. It's how do we make this environment more happy and safe for everybody?
yeah,
And sometimes people need, some groups or some friends or whoever, I mean, need more assistance than others. And I think that's the awareness piece that we want to have that positivity towards. And honestly, I feel like this podcast is part of doing that, saying,
yeah.
hey, additional information and resources, do with it as you will.
I think what's interesting about what you're saying, this fear that we're going to transfer power completely, I think that the interesting thing about that is that the assumption then is that if we were to shift power, right? Say I'm
Mhm.
going to take power from evangelical white men and I'm going to give it to Black people, Black women, and then what's going to happen? And I think that the fear is that those people who we've oppressed over time are then going to become oppressors and treat us in the same way that we treated them. And I feel like that's the problematic thinking right there, is that if I've been, okay, not I am, but I have been, or my history is filled with
Mhm.
this egregious behavior. And if I then give the power to the person that I have harmed, they're going to harm me back.
Mhm.
They're going to take that power and they're going to be harmful with it. But why? Why is that our assumption? Why is the assumption that power equals harm and harm
Mhm.
equals power? And that's the thing that I find really interesting about some of this discourse. So I don't know if anyone's noticed, but my last name is Blumendahl. It has way too many vowels for its sounds. And so I'm of Dutch descent. And so the Dutch are well known for trying to overtake the entire world by force. And it wasn't a great thing. And reparations have not been made to the extent that they should have been. However, I feel like there has been, for me, this understanding that like that was really shitty. That should not have happened. That was bad. And now I understand that living in this very colonial way where I thought, well, I didn't think personally, but like the Dutch thought that they could just go and take people and rule their lives and take their land and their spices. Thank you for the spices, though, because they were really good. Like they could take things and just have them be theirs. Not okay. But I understand that now as a human, right? That I can be an anti racist and say, that wasn't okay. Sorry about that. I don't
Mhm.
ascribe to that. But I don't think that the other people are now going to come and take my land and my child and my spices.
Mhm.
I
Well, it's,
don't know
I
what
wonder if
spices
people,
they would be. But
yeah, I mean,
like,
I wonder if people feel that way because that's maybe what they would do, and that's why they're scared. Because if they had that position, well, what does this retribution look like? And also, I know this is like a generalization. We don't know exactly how people feel in that particular
right.
component, but people have
Yes.
said that. I mean, that's verbiage around this piece and the fear associated with that.
And maybe that's what it is. It's just this fear of
Hmm.
some sort of retribution. And maybe
Hmm.
retribution is deserved. Or maybe retribution is what we expect because of our, I don't know, religious leanings or political leanings or something our mom taught us when we were young. But I think that maybe that's what needs to be let go of. The idea that, oh, if we switched roles, you would want some sort of payback. Yeah.
Hmm.
when really maybe all we want is equality. I recently saw someone say that like the trans agenda is living to or having a normal life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
As though like really all we want is to not have our life expectancy be less than what
Mm-hmm.
your life expectancy is as a person who is non-trans, right?
Exactly.
So not
Mm-hmm.
more, not better, just the same. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I too would like to access this environment with less bandwidth.
Yes,
Like
exactly.
I would like to be on the train without being accosted. I'd like to go to the grocery store without being accosted. I'd like to just sit in my freaking living room and not have a commercial show up saying that I don't belong here. And I think that kind of speaks to how do we do that and when do those conversations happen in many cases. I know I've talked a lot about how we've seen verbiage around, well, if middle schoolers are experiencing this or younger kids are experiencing this.
Yeah,
Ooh, excuse me. Can we edit that sneeze out?
maybe we'll see whether my skills can adapt.
Sign up for Patreon to listen to the sneezes. Uh,
Sneezes and curses.
Sneezes and curses. Oh, that's going on the quotes list. Uh, that sounds like some kind of witch thing.
Sneezes and curses.
Sneezes and curses. Christy B. 20. But yeah, so when we're talking about how early do these conversations happen, how we've seen, well, if you're young enough to experience it, you're young enough to talk about it, and other people are young enough to go through that. And I think that's what people fear, because doing this work takes effort and takes a lot of pieces that might quote unquote threaten the not just the power per se, but wait,
Yeah.
this is another thing I have to think about now, or another thing I have to do. Not that it's laziness per se, but it's just another component that I think people fear as well. And if we're teaching younger folks or like they're interacting with the world in a particular way, I mean, that shaping happens so early.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. It's intriguing. I recently had a interaction with someone where they were like, "Well, my child shouldn't have to deal with these kinds of concepts," as though like things like disability and race and these sorts of discussions were too much to have to be burdened with. And I kept thinking to myself, except for those of us who are born with things like a particular race or
Mm-hmm.
particular ability, like, or disability, that is a thing that we deal with at whatever age. We don't get out of it. There's no little bubble that we get wrapped up
Mm-hmm.
in, and we don't have to deal with it. So why does
Exactly.
one part of society have to deal with it and then the other part of society doesn't have to deal with it? And
Mm-hmm.
I've just felt like, oh, we shouldn't have to talk about mental illness until we're adults. And I was thinking to myself, no, I've had to deal with this since I was in single digits. Like I was literally 9 years old when I started having to cope with
Mm-hmm.
mental illness. And that to say that everybody else didn't have to accommodate my mental illness until they were adults, like that's ridiculous. So I was already having symptoms at age 9, but somehow my peers shouldn't have to cope with that until they were 25. So I
Mm-hmm.
should just struggle on my own to cope with whatever was happening in my life from age 9 to
Exactly.
25. Like that makes no sense. That makes no sense whatsoever. My
I totally.
environment should support me from age 9 through
Mm-hmm.
all the way through. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
not there should not be a point in time where my peers were not taught how to support me.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that people push back against to a certain degree of, well, we don't want to talk about this when they're younger. It's, well, yeah, I'm not going to say words like adjudicate with a 4-year-old or like, Luca, let's talk about recidivism today and the school to prison pipeline. And we're not talking about it like that.
Right.
We can incorporate and model inclusive behavior earlier on and talk about the positive aspects, because the positive aspects of inclusion are much easier to talk about. And I feel like we talk about that in kindergarten and then stop when I've, whenever there's a major developmental change from like 8th grade to high school or from high school to college, I feel like we need like a re-up of the things we learned in kindergarten. Like,
Right, because like,
hey,
why do
that's
we learn about sharing and including everyone when we're in
diapers.
preschool, and then after
Yeah,
that, it's mine. Yeah, you can't have any. Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. And I think that's the fear. Maybe people don't know how to have those conversations and they say, well, let kids be kids. And you're formulating who that kid is going to be as an adult. So by the time you're 18, 19, 20, when you're quote unquote supposed to be learning these things, you've already formulated a whole worldview that is difficult to unseat because you've had your whole life thinking a particular way, and it takes people decades to reconcile that.
Yeah.
So if we're able to do that at an earlier stage, I feel like that would be better for society. And we have articles and whole programs that suggest that and say that. I'm not saying like we're not here to try to make people feel bad. We're here to try to get people to think and engage in discourse in a way that is going to be safe for the people around them.
Yeah.
And if that's quote unquote woke, then sure. But why is that so
Sure.
threatening?
Yes. Yes, then sure. Let's be woke. Let's
Yeah.
let's be woke.
Yeah. Let's just
I
be
don't
good
mind.
people. Cool. Yeah.
I know. I If being a decent human is being woke, then I would appreciate that. I feel like
Yeah.
being decent humans
Hmm.
would be good. Oh,
Hmm.
which is interesting because I was looking at some sweatshirts the other day on Mahogany Mommies, and there's one that says, being a good human matters.
Hmm.
And I was like, yes. Yes, it does. Like, being a good
Exactly.
human matters. It's
One,
important. Yeah.
and just because we have those labels or those things that we ascribe to, or groups or religions or whatever that say, like, generally I do this and this is the godly way, or this is the way my community does it, it also doesn't give you free range to say that other people are doing it wrong, or turn around very easily and say, well, you're not part of my group and you're not engaging in this way, therefore you're incorrect and I don't like you, and you discriminate, and you model that and the kids see it, and then it perpetuates, and then everybody's like, why is this happening? Well, that's built in.
Right. Exactly. Like, it's not an
Hmm.
excuse to say, oh, but this is what my holy book says, and so I get to be X. I think that we're all in a space at this point, at least I hope that humanity has evolved to the point where, no, okay, that your book says X. However, it is wrong to treat people in a way that devalues them in such violent and terrible ways. So you also don't get to do that. You can think what you think, but you can't treat people in a way that is maybe so negative. I don't know. I think that's a hard one. That's a hard one to answer. And it's a hard one for
Yeah.
me coming out of a religious upbringing and
Hmm.
having gone to 2 seminaries and whatever else. That's a hard one for me to answer. Not for
Hmm.
myself, but I think to in discourse with other people. For myself,
Yeah.
no, you evolve, you change. The book is
Hmm.
old. Get over
Yeah.
it. But for other people, I understand that it's not that easy to do. But I think what's easy for me to say is, oh, how to be an anti-racist. That book exists. Let's read that book. White fragility. That book exists. Let's read
Hmm.
that book. Let's figure that out. So let go of these misperceptions that say, I can start this anti DEI thing
Hmm.
and not have to deal with my insecurities or my fears,
Hmm.
because I can just place my insecurities and my fears on someone who's already having to cope with extra burdens because of the place in the system where they live, and not
Exactly.
have to deal with my stuff. No, not okay. At this point, you deal with your stuff. Deal with your
Hmm.
stuff. Do it.
And to tie it back to the over performative way we expect people to operate, at
Yeah.
least in this particular culture, I know you and I have talked about this. I've talked about this with a bunch of people as well, of the quote unquote, the tyranny of the just do this, just stop being depressed, just stop being racist, just be more inclusive, just be less inclusive, just do whatever, insert whatever
Yeah.
thing here, just stop being disabled. Oh, yes, I know you have ADHD, but if you just make a calendar, you can just focus. And I mean, shit, if that worked, we wouldn't be doing this podcast, Christy.
Right? Well, how many calendars have we created over the years? Holy shit. I mean,
I
come
mean,
on.
how many times have we set a calendar thing and we're like, yeah, I'll be there in a minute, and 25 minutes later or
I
45
know.
minutes
Like,
over. I mean,
time
it's
blindness is a real thing. Time
exactly.
blindness. Yeah.
So when we're talking about these pieces, that's on both ends of this. I feel like more quote unquote conservative people, meant not to overgeneralize that at all, but it seems to be the prevailing thing currently.
Yeah.
Folks that are a little bit more conservative, well, let's not put this in a frame of coordination here. Let's just say folks that are more intolerant to change and resistant to that.
There we go.
Not always conservative, because it happens on the liberal side too. Right? There's a
It
change.
happens on all sides, yes.
Exactly. It can't be the people who are flexible telling the inflexible people, hey, you just have to think about this more. There has to be action. There has to be places to do this and fail in a safe way as much as possible. But also, if it's failing not in a safe way and you screwed up and you lose your job, I mean, that's also not uncalled for. I think there are some situations where it was like, I think that person, that could have been a great learning opportunity, not this person should have left that post. There's definitely extreme positions like that.
Yeah.
That goes into, I know what you and I have been talking a lot about, Christy, of cool, we have this thing, we have this book, we have this theory, we have this approach, but they all say, be aware of this. And as almost as if the awareness is enough to beget the correct behavior. But if we don't have an example of what that correct behavior looks like, or any example of what that behavior looks like, how are we ever supposed to learn that?
Yes, that is an excellent point. And I think lived experience makes a big difference. I literally was watching something this morning. I want to find it back because I don't want to misquote it. Maybe I'll find it later and add it to the show notes. But I was watching, not like a podcast, but a little mini short thing today. And they were talking about lived experience. And they were saying, like, look, you can't read a book on swimming and then go jump in the lake because like you will drown. That is not an acceptable way to learn swimming. You have to actually have the experience of being in the water and putting your face in and blowing the bubbles, right? This is they didn't say all that. I'm adding that because I feel like that's important steps. But anyway,
This is not a prescription for swimming, folks.
kick the legs, do the strokes. No, you have to learn the swimming in an experiential way in order to get to the point where you are a swimmer, right? This is not read the concept, do the thing. You definitely have to have practice at it. And I think that's fair. And I also think, as with many things, there's not this black and white, like, oh, here very extreme examples of this is very correct and this is very incorrect. There are those examples. We can point to examples of this is very incorrect, this is very correct, but there has to be some area in between where people can figure it out, ask questions, live through it, get there over time. And I think that applies to all sorts of things. But I also think that you have to recognize when you have privilege and be okay with bumping up against people who don't want to educate you in that moment as well. So I feel like sometimes people, I don't know, I get upset sometimes when people stare at me when I'm out. I use a Nordic walking stick sometimes instead of a cane because I find it keeps me more upright and I don't lean over as much and I have better posture, but it also keeps me from falling down when I'm out and about on the very uneven pavement in Chicago. But people stare. They look at me really weird. Like, why do you have a hiking pole? Why do you have a ski pole? And I don't always like to be stared at. And I don't always like when people ask me about it because I'm tired and I'm whatever. And I'm dealing with the pavement and I don't really care about your questions right now. So
Exactly.
I think you have to understand that it's not my responsibility to guide you through this process, but also
Mhm.
there is room, and I understand there is room for you to ask questions about why I have a ski pole in the middle of the very nice spring weather on the street in downtown Chicago. So
Yeah,
there's
it's like,
give and take. There's give and take with this situation. And we all have to find where our boundaries
mhm.
are on what days and like work together on it. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Why do I use the ski pole? I don't know, because it's a very effective tool for walking, as you might have known. Why you can tact it as something that's used for walking, but because it's out of this context, it looks weird. It's how to, and perhaps honestly, Chris, there's probably a whole other episode of how do you allow for and foster that curiosity, but also not put
Yeah.
all of the mental burden on yourself or other people to be able to answer a particular question or give additional info, or you're like, yeah, cool, thanks for talking about that, let me relive my trauma so that you can learn something, maybe, hopefully.
Yes, and I think because I think every disabled person has that where we want to help
Mhm,
you, but we also don't. We are also exhausted. It's not our
mhm,
job to help you. So
mhm.
yeah, I think it's a both and situation. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, to think about this, I think we hit a lot of the components we have, and we can obviously talk honestly about each of these topics as many episodes. I know we found things like what is quote unquote successful DEI initiatives, and there's 13 steps, and here's all the resources, which I feel like I'm very prone to. I can't undo that part of my brain all the time.
I
Um,
know, but even
but
those 13 steps didn't mention disability at all.
no, it didn't. So it says things, and we'll put this in the show notes too. It'll be like implement diverse hiring practices. Well, how that? What kind of guidance
How?
you got for that,
Yeah,
buddy?
what is
Like, what?
that? What is that? Yeah, how do I
Yeah,
do that? How does a
yeah.
low vision
Post it.
person access my website? Do I know how to do that?
Exactly.
No,
Exactly. I mean,
I don't. I run an
host inclusive
accessibility
social
podcast
events.
and I don't know how to do that. I know, it's terrible.
Yeah. Or pay attention to your language. Oh, I'm totally attending to it, but I don't know what to do instead. So, I mean, that's why I hope podcasts like this and the work that we're doing and the work that we're trying to highlight for other people can help fill in those, well, what now? Like, I'm ready to create a DEI culture. I'm ready to promote pay equity. I'm ready to host inclusive social events. I just don't know how to do that or where to even start. And hopefully, as we talk with people and we're creating these initiatives and collaboratives, that people can have access to those resources at the end of the day.
Yes, exactly. That's definitely our goal to keep on fostering that environment so that we,
Mhm.
yes, to get more people to have more concepts of how to be more inclusive. And that doesn't mean
Exactly.
we're ever finished with this process, but to start, let's all start.
Exactly. So, what do you think, especially with the topic today and the types of things that we've talked about? If you had to leave the audience with just like some main takeaways, what would you say? Well, what are some things that starting points or thoughts to mull over before we get to the next episodes where some of those things will be answered?
Well, true story there, because we are going to talk about some of these. Rocco and I have all of these discussions. We have so many discussions and side discussions and like text discussions. And we're like, oh gosh, we should write that down. There's so much stuff. But I think we were talking about it, was it yesterday? And we were like, yeah, we should talk about the barriers, but we should also talk about, well, how do you climb over, roll
Mhm.
over, or however you get over. But
Walk with, over, around, through.
right, be dragged over, whatever needs to happen to get you over. So, but I was thinking about that, right? Like, here's
Mhm.
barriers, and then how do we get over the barriers? And I think so. One thing is, well, keep listening for more. That's one thing,
Mhm.
because we do have some great, just to toot our own horn.
We've gotten some traction and people are on board with the same values we have. And it's cool to see that and to start sharing that for sure.
Yes, we have so many amazing things coming down the line here because we have a lot of people that have been like, oh, hey, I heard about this and I want to be involved. So we do have some great things coming up for like ways that you can be more inclusive. We have people that are just starting their journey with
Mm-hmm.
inclusivity and how they are trying to change their venues and make things better. And so they're starting, which I think will be great for some people. And then we have people who've been working in disability and policy and all of these things for like years and years. And I think that'll be amazing too to hear. So there's one thing. I think the other thing is this discussion of the woke agenda and creating this sort of vilification of things. It's not helpful. It's not helpful. And I think one of the things that I would really want to say is just to try and reconcile what is it about your own privilege or your own fear or your own stuff that maybe needs to be worked through in order for you to not jump into one camp or another camp. And not that you can't lean a direction. When we were thinking about this episode and talking about it comes into right? We looked at some politicians' sites and things like that. It came into politics a lot. And we were like, do we want to make a political stance this early? And I was like, I think my politics comes out of like how people treat their voting power
Mm-hmm.
based on my particular situation, which is
Mm-hmm.
living as a queer disabled woman. That puts me on one side politically, but it doesn't have to put me in a camp per se.
Exactly.
I can be thoughtful about who I vote for. I can be thoughtful about what I support. I can be
Mm-hmm.
thoughtful about all of these different things. And I think that's maybe the things that I want to leave as takeaways is to like know where the things you support are coming out of and where they're heading toward, and make sure that they're aligned with your values, not just
because, right?
yes, not just
Yeah.
because. And
Yeah. I don't
and then
have to do this because I have these identities. I can do this in line with my identities, but I can also depart from what people expect.
yes, and then change where change needs to happen. Even if your community or your family or your whatever isn't in the same place as you, that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. Change where change needs to happen. And as you see, oh, I need to evolve here, that's fine. Work your way through it. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that's an ugly process. Sometimes that's challenging, but it's also worth it. I think it's so worth it to come out the other side and say, I made these developments in my life. I came to a better understanding of myself, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm doing the work to become a better human and be more
Yeah.
supportive of all the humans. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Live
Did
your
that
life
even
with
make
intention.
sense? That was
Oh,
very
I mean,
discombobulated.
absolutely. No, I totally think that makes sense. It's you're living your life with intentionality and being flexible when things work and flexible when things don't work. And I think that extends out to other people as we just practice this more. Because it's like you said, we're not going to be able just to listen to this podcast and be like, oh, cool. Well, I listened to this Disability Tangent podcast. Therefore, I am anti-ableist now. You have to
Right? Yeah.
do the thing.
No, it's work. It's work. There's work in it.
Exactly.
It takes a lot. And like I definitely am like, no, don't be ableist, but I still sometimes I have internalized ableism. I have things that
Hmm.
were learned over time. Like that's it's not. And
Exactly.
I call myself an anti-racist, but that doesn't mean that I didn't grow up in an all-white place with all white
Hmm.
people learning all white things. What? No.
And that's the thing. Maybe it's not labels we give ourselves, but we're like labeling the value that we're trying to enact. Like
Yes.
it's a lifelong thing that doesn't always work well. And people listening to the podcast, I mean, might be students where they've offered me the grace to screw up and have those moments where I was not engaging in that particular value, or I was doing it in a way that made them uncomfortable. And how do we create that space to feel better and to learn overall? So hopefully we can do that. So I hope that as people are listening to this, and I know we obviously covered a lot of contentious topics.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear from people. How did we approach that? Did that work? Were just because we're doing this podcast, we're not sitting here as experts, and we're not claiming to be. I
No.
want to
What can we do better? Yeah, feel free to email us at disabilitytangent@gmail.com. Tell us, what can we do better? Because we are learning. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Sorry, did I cut you off? That was my. I
No,
just
not at
jumped
all.
on
No,
the
that was
dopamine
perfect.
train there. Yeah.
Hey, no.
Also, that was the correct email, wasn't
That
it?
was. We did it.
I had to really think about it. I was like, wait, what's our email? We have an email address. I know we do.
As we were talking and we're saying, just as like a final thing, I don't even know if this is a final thing or this is just a blooper. I was thinking about who we have coming on and what we have in store for people. And for some reason, I don't. This comes from my mom. So, Mom, if you're listening, I really appreciate your ability to teach me how to put anything to a song. We've got airports, professors, and leaders to talk to, inclusion, equity, and goals we can run through. Aha!
Whoa!
One day we'll sing it.
You didn't sing it. You just.
I know. I'm very self-conscious. I don't know if I'm ready to put that on the air.
You're not ready to sing for us?
No, I think this goes with our drinking conversation earlier. I'm sure if we recorded...
Or a little later or a little drunker or a little...
Well,
Gavin had 2 glasses of wine and it worked out great! If you didn't listen to the end of the episode, you didn't hear that part.
No, and it's not that we promote those pieces, but hey, listen, that's some ways to build that courage and fluidity and fluency and comfortability. Sometimes it takes a little extra.
We also appreciate sobriety, and if you are living a sober lifestyle, we commend you.
Exactly.
We just don't happen to be doing the same at this particular time. Was that my microphone picking up?
It might have been.
Sirens
Something happened in the background. I'm like, what happened?
Sirens of Chicago.
Hey, listen, we are in a city. It happens, and there's people, and there's a lot of opportunities for people to do things, and sirens are one of them.
Sirens are a thing.
Sirens are a thing.
Sirens are a thing.
Oh my gosh. Join us next time for a captivating episode where we sit down with 2 autistic researchers to delve into their unique experiences as clinicians with disabilities.
We cover it all, from their educational journeys to their impactful community work and everything in between.
Tune in for insightful conversations that shed light on the intersection of disability and clinical practice.
Don't miss out.
Okay, well, I got to get running to the next training here.
All right. Stack those appointments.
That's what life is now, right?
Produce. Life of production. Bootstrapping.
I feel like we had this whole episode of, it's cool, we don't have to be performative. Also, here's the 16 things I have to do today, otherwise I will feel bad about myself.
I don't even have a real job, and I still have a list.
I think work is work.
Work is work.
Be paid to do, although it would be nice. But
it would be nice to be paid. Being paid would be nice.
Follow us on Patreon.
Knowing that groceries were going to arrive, that would be nice. Yes.
Yeah.
Are going to arrive. How are they going to arrive? That's the other thing. I don't know. They're just going to.
Are they available?
They're just going to float in on the breeze with ease.
Yeah, that's the new Samsung fridge. It just appears in your fridge.
It just appears.
Subscription, and it's there now.
Magic. Sneezes and curses. Achoo! Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Groceries.
That was the... Oh my god, that caught me so off guard. Holy shit.
I'm still recording.
No, oh, Jesus. sneeze, wiggle, 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 and groceries. And that's the Disability Tangent Podcast.